Broadcasting to you from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome to The Gailey Show. I am your host, John Parker. Clearly, there's a lot happening in the news today. If you haven't been listening to the Stephanie Miller Show or the Tom Hartman Show, stay tuned for the Matt McNeil Show and Native Roots Radio. They're going to cover those beautifully. Today on The Gailey Show, it is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest or two for the episode to help us think more clearly and more queerly on the major issues of the day facing the LGBTQ and allied community. Today, we have two guests. Gabby Pierce is the communications manager at Gender Justice. Monica Meyer is the political director and trans equity trainer at Gender Justice, founded in Minnesota. If you don't know about Gender Justice, they work across the upper Midwest to dismantle the legal, structural, and cultural barriers that contribute to gender inequity. They envision a world where everyone can thrive regardless of their gender expression, or sexual orientation. Part of how they do this work, and they do a lot of ways of doing this work, is through strategic and impact litigation. So you'll see them on a lot of cases clarifying what the law actually means in practice, setting powerful legal precedents on a particular issue, changing the interpretation of the law, and raising new and important issues as yet unaddressed by the courts. Another way they do this is through public education, and that is what we'll be talking about with Gabby and Monica today. So Monica and Gabby, welcome to The Gailey Show.
Thanks so much for having us on. We're really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So we're going to dive into specifically your trans equity training, because suddenly everyone everywhere thinks that they're an expert on the trans community and the trans experience. So we thought this would be great to have actual experts walk us through a training that you all do with a variety of different organizations. So why don't we start with, what are your trans equity trainings? Monica, I put this to you. And why did Gender Justice start hosting them?
Sure. Well, so we started just looking at all of the discriminatory policies that were being launched in a bunch of states around the country. So 2023 saw a big proliferation of like anti-LGBTQ legislation, with the majority of the bills being targeted at discriminating against trans youth and trans adults. And we know that every time we have elected officials, legislatures who are putting forward this, this discriminatory legislation, they're also backing it with a lot of misinformation, a lot of fear mongering, and a lot of hate. And so we were, looking at, well, what do we do? We have lots of things that we're doing in Minnesota, and we can talk about that in a little bit, about the policies and the protections in Minnesota and the great legislation we've passed and the lawsuits we've won. But beyond that, the other part about our work is really making sure that people know how to talk about trans issues, know how to really help do the cultural change work. And also, we want to help people be able to really cut through the misinformation that they're hearing, and to really see through that there's elected officials who are really trying to use, trans people as a political wedge issue. And they're really, calling on and trying to divide people with the lives of trans people. And so we really wanted to say, like, how do we make sure that we have a lot of people who care and love trans people? How do we get a lot of people together who really care about making our world what we think it and know it should be, which is one that is loving, that is full of justice, where people can be who they are, and be able to live their full, happy lives. And so I just, in my experience, I've been doing this kind of work for 30 years. And this kind of work is like thinking about, how do we really bring out the best in people and mobilize people to become like these justice-loving activists, and give them the tools that they need. And so that's what the whole idea around the trans equity trainings is about that.
I love the justice-loving phrase. We need to put that on like t-shirts and mugs and posters as we're protesting. Who do you typically offer and work with when you're doing these trainings?
We've had over 400 people who've gone to the trainings. We've done some in person and some virtually, and we are really looking for people who are thinking like, I have a lot of questions, or I want to know how to take action, or maybe I need a little bit more experience because I don't know how to cut through the transphobia I'm hearing. And so right now, we're going to keep offering these trainings, and then we're also having people come together and actually do work together in person, just so that we can really think about like, how do we really mobilize people to really get out there and to make people really come out on the side of being active for trans equity.
Right. So I was looking through the materials that you use in the program, and I guess we can start with the president's executive order stating that there are only 2 biological genders, which ignores a huge swath of biological science on what gender is. So your training starts with the fundamentals rooted in decades of peer-reviewed scientific research. I repeat that a lot on this show. But gender identity and gender expression, how do we define them? Maybe, Gabby, do you want to start with you, and then we can go to Monica?
Yeah. I mean, I think to put it like just simply, gender identity is who you are. Gender expression is how you show that to the world. And, ideally, both of these things should not be restricted, not be the subject of hate and, tools of fear-mongering for political gain. And I think what we really want to work towards is just a world where these things are allowed to be free from, confinement and restriction and all of the propaganda these days. But yeah, Monica, do you have anything you want to add?
I'll just say we do a pretty brief discussion around the terms and definitions, and I would say the reason why we do it, we know everyone can Google. Like, we know everyone can just like look on, and like with AI now, you're just like inundated. But the reason why we do it is we want people to know the terms, and also to feel comfortable with if they have questions, or if they're not quite sure, that they're asking people, and that also if they make mistakes, that they really are, like, if we really try to tell people, like, if you make a mistake and you misgender somebody, or you say something that doesn't come out quite the right way, that you just apologize and move on. And that, if you're putting your heart into working on trans justice, like, everyone can see that. And we really want to make sure that if one of the biggest barriers that people have who like are really want to be an activist for trans equality, for trans justice, like, if their biggest barrier is they're afraid to make a mistake and offend somebody, we don't want that to be their biggest barrier. And so we really just, I think we want to give people, like, here's some definitions, know that they change, know that you can stay current, and that's okay to also make mistakes. So we do that piece pretty quickly.
Yeah. And the terms change because the science is ever expanding, teaching us, and we're learning more about gender identity. I mean, I just saw I saw a video that came out this week of a debate in the Texas legislature. They were, again, legislation proclaiming that there are 2 genders. I don't know if either of you saw this, and a legislator asked the bill's author, like, okay, what would the impact be on intersex people based off of if we pass through legislation? And on camera, the bill's author's like, I don't know what that is. And they had to be explained to him by the legislator asking the questions. And they were like, oh, that can't. And the guy's like, that can't be a thing. And one of his colleagues is like tugging on his sleeve going, no, you're wrong. This is intersex people exist. Like, it was so embarrassing to see that. So I love that you start with the terms and the definitions, and you acknowledge that, science informs and continues to expand our knowledge of these, of all of everything that comes into gender, rather. Can you speak to some of the most common misconceptions or challenges that people face when they're talking about trans issues and policy and legislation?
Some of the biggest, I feel like the questions that we get are pretty tactical. And I would say that it's because we have people who are coming to our trainings who are like, sign me up. There's been a few people who have come who have, I think, some lingering questions around some areas of policy and some of the rhetoric and the discrimination that they're hearing out there from like President Trump to local elected officials. But I think so one of the things we try to do is we actually get people to talk about their experience with their gender. And that is something that is really important because it starts to, I used to do trainings a while ago and we would go deep into biology and talk about chromosomes and sex and gender. Right. And at some point you're like, it becomes so heady where people are leaving their like feelings in their heart out of it. And that's not what this is about. Like, you don't need to become a scientist or a doctor to be for trans rights. And so I will say that people do have questions about some of the science. We have a lot of information on Gender Justice's website about it, but we try to get people back into their like feelings and like experience of like, what's your experience with gender? And the reason why we do that is so that people see that gender is not a binary, and both expression, identity, to really kind of break it open a little bit. And to me, that's been really important. But then what people also want to talk about is how do you refute the policies that want to discriminate against trans people and inclusion in sports, healthcare for trans youth, some of the other they also generally, I think, even if people don't want to talk about it, they want to talk about the public accommodations and trans people using restrooms and locker rooms. And so that one generally people don't want to ask about, but in the back of their head, they're like, how do I refute what people are saying? So those are some of the issues that we end up talking about, but we are not providing. We don't want to say here's the one statement that you need to memorize.
Right.
That's the silver bullet. And as soon as people hear that, they're going to be like, wow, okay, there goes all my questions. Because that's actually, for one, that's not how this works.
No. And I want to take a break because I want to talk about why that doesn't work and some of these other issues when we come back. We're going to have more with Gabby and Monica from Justice. Quick break, more to come on The Gailey Show. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I am your host, John Parker. It is 21 minutes past the hour. We are here with Gabby Pierce, Communications Manager at Gender Justice, and Monica Meyer, the Political Director and Trans Equity Trainer at Gender Justice. It is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, and they're helping us think more clearly and queerly about trans equity trainings. And before the break, we were starting to get into folks wanting to have that sort of silver bullet to cut through all the noise and the BS and the hatred that's coming at us from these, neo-fascist movements that are really attacking the trans and queer community. Gabby, as the communications manager, when you're working with folks in these trainings, what is the advice you give to folks to sort of begin to cut through all of that noise?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think when you just take a step back and look at why all of these different talking points and all of these different pieces of misinformation against trans people are floating around, it's you realize this is all actually the result of, the millions and millions of dollars that have been poured into these campaigns to get people to start to question and discount the humanity of trans people. And I think the best counter to that is just regrounding in the fact that this isn't actually an inherently controversial issue. This isn't a complicated issue. This is just about trans people, and trans people are people like anyone else. I think it's really important to just kind of bring people back into that place of understanding that trans personhood is a valid, normal, and natural form of humanity that has always been around across centuries and cultures, really as long as like humans have been around and had conceptions of gender. And so I think grounding in that really is an important first step, because it just kind of puts it all in perspective. And, I think it illuminates the fact that all of these conversations and quote unquote debates about trans people and the issues impacting trans people a lot of times are not actually coming from a sincere place. A lot of times they're coming from a political campaign designed to get people, discounting other people's humanity for political gain. And I don't think that is like an inner state of mind that people generally want to be in. I think people can be moved to that point by lots of propaganda. But generally, I like to think that, the natural place people want to approach this issue from at the start is to just understand other people's humanity. And I think there's a lot of power in that.
I agree. And I think there's some really interesting data also that I want to tell certain politicos that there's some data that says that campaigning actually doesn't work. When you're trying to be super anti-trans and anti-queer in your political campaign ads, that it actually kind of backfires and isn't the motivator that everyone thinks that it is. Yeah, that's another issue for what we cover here on the Gailey Show. There are a couple things that I feel folks are getting hung up on, even folks that purport to be our allies. One of them, and maybe you can help us help folks navigate the conversation, but in a way that gets back to what you're talking about, Gabby. One of them being apparently the great issue of our time, which is not climate change or the trade war or immigration or the epidemic of gun violence. The great issue of our time, which the legislatures are all spending their time working on, is trans athletes. And some people say that I'm for trans rights, but it's unfair about trans athletes in sports. And I'm like, well, less than 1% of NCAA athletes are trans. So, I mean, just facts. But how do you recommend for folks, if it comes up in your trainings, sort of navigating this and getting back to the trans personhood and not getting caught in the weeds of propaganda? I don't know who wants to take that first. That was a huge question. I mean, Monica, do you want to start? And then Gabby, you can go next.
Yeah, I'll start. So one of the things that we do in the trainings is we know that this is one of the issues that we think is a good entry-level way to talk about trans issues with people that you know in your life. And it's a tough one. It's also one that people are hearing out in the world a lot. So we may as well take advantage of that. So when we're asking activists, advocates, supporters to say you're going to go and sit down at your Thanksgiving table and guess what you're going to talk about? Mm-hmm. And what's that hook going to be? And so we really are advocating for people to use one of two issues for having those conversations. The most clear issue that we think is a good one to bring up is that this is a little bit of a longer story, but at Gender Justice, we worked with J.C. Cooper, who is a trans athlete who's a powerlifter, and we sued USA Powerlifting. And right now that lawsuit is before the Minnesota Supreme Court, and we're waiting for their ruling. And what we think is really helpful is if we had people who are out there just talking with people about trans inclusion in sports. And what we're doing, so this is like a good way to get involved in gender justice, but we're asking people to sign on to our letter in support of J.C. Cooper and trans inclusion in sports. And then we're asking people to get others to do that. And so that's the action step. And we're basically we want people to write a little plan of I'm going to talk to Aunt so-and-so and my coworker about trans inclusion. I'm going to ask them to sign this letter. And that way it's a good entryway to have the conversation and to see where people are at and to know that sometimes it's not a one-time conversation. It could be many. In my experience, I worked on the marriage equality in Minnesota when we had to fight the constitutional amendment that would have banned the freedom to marry for same-sex couples. And we really found that the way that you win on these issues is by having these longer conversations, because we really want to change the culture. And so this case is, and this campaign is a really good way to do that. And so we try to give people a lot of tools for those conversations about talking about freedom, but also to talk about what's at the heart of discrimination. So like, it literally is the definition of discrimination when you ban somebody from sports, public, from the bathroom, from the locker room, from, you name it, from school, you name it. That's the literal definition of discrimination. So that's one of the pieces that we try to get them to talk about. And then we get them to actually start to talk about, like, if people really care about women's sports, which is most of the talk about banning trans people from sports is around women's sports, that they would really look at what actually some of the biggest issues in women's sports are, which is that there's pay inequity, that there's a lack of resources, and then that there's that still there hasn't been enough attention on sexual harassment. So it's one of the things that still doesn't make people feel okay, then I'm supportive. And then we want people to talk about that everyone should have access to the sports that.
Let's pick up right there on the access part of it, because I got to fit in a quick break here. We're going to have more with Gabby and Monica from Gender Justice. Keep it tuned. You are listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. From the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is The Gailey Show. I am your host, John Parker. It is 33 minutes past the hour. It is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest or guests for the episode to help us think more clearly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. With me today is Monica Meyer, the political director and trans equity trainer at Gender Justice, and Gabby Pierce, the communications manager at Gender Justice. We are talking about their trans equity training. And for folks who haven't had a chance to go through that training, we're learning all about it here today. And we're going to have links in our show notes and on our website for how you can participate not only in this work, but all of the amazing work that Gender Justice is doing to protect and advance the rights of our community. We were talking about the greatest issue of the day, which I really actually appreciated as I was listening to both of you before the break, about how trans athletes in sports can be a way in to this conversation of promoting and advocating for equity. And we were talking about access, but Gabby, do you want to sort of pick us up in the conversation about how we are going about and using this as an opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the first things I like to just get out of the way in this conversation is the fact that trans athletes after HRT, hormone replacement therapy, compete statistically at the same levels as their cisgender teammates. These arguments against trans athletes and against trans inclusion in sports are not rooted in science. They are plain and simple just about divide and conquer. It's about pitting cis people and trans people against each other. It's about distracting people from real issues. And I think once that is understood and clear, it gives us the ability to take a look at what's really at stake. And I think, first off is just the joy of sports, right? Trans athletes deserve the same opportunities to compete and to grow and belong and be part of a team as any other athlete. And protecting their right to play and to compete ensures that sports remain a space for everyone to experience teamwork and resilience and community. And I think this is also really about just the integrity of women's sports. Monica was touching a little bit on some of the real threats facing women's sports, like pay inequity and racism, lack of funding. and the kind of constructed arguments and pieces of misinformation about trans athletes in sports really distracts from that. And I think it's important to ask, like, what are the real issues actually facing women's sports, because it is not trans athletes. And at the end of the day, I think this is really also just about like a need to reground in trans humanity. Like I said earlier, trans people have always been a part of our communities, and these efforts to exclude trans people from sports are really much bigger than just the issue of sports. It's all part of a broader campaign to erase trans people from public life. And I think it's really critical to really resist that and push back. And I think people want to do that. I mean, when you unpack all of this, you dispel some of the myths, you illustrate how trans people compete at the same level as their cis teammates, and you refocus the conversation on what's really at stake, how this is about trying to erase trans people from public life, distract people from real issues facing women and women's sports. I think people tend to resonate with that and want to be part of the work to start to push back and change the conversation on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you mentioned how this is a coordinated systemic attack. And I think a lot of folks see the executive orders and think this is the law of the land all of a sudden, that he can just sign things and boom. But in Minnesota, we've been doing the work for a long time. One of the first state, I think, in the country to put gender identity into the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Monica, can you talk us through the protections that we have in Minnesota? Like, we are a trans refuge state. Like, what is available, like, in that regard for our community here in Minnesota?
Sure. You know, I think one of the other things that we're trying to do is get the word out, not just through our trainings, but just in any way we can. Is we should, in Minnesota, we should just be really aware of the history of trans inclusion we have in our laws around protecting people from discrimination. So, and like just a long history. So I think that also is helpful for poking holes in any of the fear mongering. But in Minnesota, we have, as you said, we were the first state in our Human Rights Act. When we passed it in 1993, we passed really strong protections, barring discrimination in public accommodations, housing, education, and employment for LGBTQ people. And we were the first state to include trans people in those anti-discrimination policies. And so we have over 30 years of experience of really protecting trans people from discrimination. And I think more importantly, just allowing trans people to live their lives and to have legal protections if they are discriminated against. But like, so all of the fear mongering, and, you know, I think the fear mongering, I don't want to go deep into that, but it really is at the heart of it is trying to make people fearful of trans people, to, as Gabby was saying, like, to dehumanize trans people. And so in Minnesota, I feel like we should say we have over 30 years of protecting LGBTQ people, including trans people, from discrimination. And we are great. Like, there's not anything to point to of any problems with being a state that provides protections for people who are trans. And then we also, just to name a few other of our laws we should be proud of, is we have the Minnesota State High School League. Over 10 years ago, they passed a policy saying that trans inclusion in sports is the law of public school sports culture, and that you have to have trans inclusion in athletics in Minnesota public schools. And again, no problems with that. Actually, just only good. There have been some cases of discrimination. And so one of the things that Gender Justice has done is been able to sue when there are when there are instances of discrimination, we've been able to sue to just be able to, again, show that it is unconstitutional in Minnesota to discriminate against trans people, non-binary people, and that we have shown that over and over again. And so, and then we should just be really excited that we're a trans refuge state, and that we have an Attorney General Keith Ellison, who is making sure that we're fortifying and like showing that we have these laws by pushing against executive orders and pushing against any of the bullying we're getting on the federal level, for being a state that that recognizes the humanity of trans people, that recognizes that discrimination means that you can, like we are a state that stands against it, and you cannot discriminate against trans people.
I think that there's an outsized level of coverage on the executive orders and not enough on folks like Attorney General Ellison, who is really signing on, and folks like yourself who are doing the fighting back, but has also been doing such amazing work for decades now in protecting trans Minnesotans and queer Minnesotans. And, you know, the high school athletic bill, like, or law, the world didn't come to an end. As you're saying, like, and we have such an amazing athletic culture here in Minnesota, and for a very long time here, the world didn't come to an end.
Right. And I mean, and I was involved in that policy. I worked with some of the youth who pushed for that policy, and they put their hearts into it. They came out, at great risk. They were such amazing leaders. They are amazing leaders. And I think that what we're asking people to do in Minnesota is to join our very incredible trans leaders in really getting more Minnesotans to be able to be vocal advocates for trans justice. And so let's do that. We have another policy that we're working on that we feel like would be really good and also helping to promote trans justice is we're working on an equal rights amendment. It would be one of the strongest equal rights amendments in the country. It would provide protections in our Constitution against discrimination based on race, ethnicity. It would be protections around reproductive freedom, protections for people with disabilities, and it would be protections for trans and LGBTQ people as well. And we know that from looking at what happened, New York passed their equal rights amendment just in this past election in November, and that, again, there were forces that made the campaign against having equal rights. They had it by promoting discrimination against trans people. And so we know, like, we want to pass an equal rights amendment, and we want to really, again, embolden Minnesotans to come out and talk about their support for trans rights, for trans people. And I'll just say finally, like, people know people now who are trans, and there's like over 42% of people now know people who are trans. And this is where we need them to be bold and to really be able to have these conversations. And so that when we have elected officials or candidates who are going to use their anti-trans rhetoric in their campaigns, that people look at that and they're like, what? I cannot vote for that person, that Neanderthal. I cannot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So much of their politics right now feels so regressive. Just cruelty for the sake of being cruel. I think that's the thing. And I think that's, for me, the most, that's so antithetical to Minnesotan culture. I've been here for like 14 years now. And the idea of being cruel for cruelty's sake is just so anathema to our culture that it's just immediately rejected.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're saying the ERA amendment, for folks who aren't maybe quite sure about the political process here, so that would be to the Minnesota Constitution?
Correct. So
how does that work out? Like, does it go to a vote, or who votes on it?
Yeah, so constitutional amendments, we don't have a lot of ballot initiatives in Minnesota. Every ballot initiative we have has to be a constitutional amendment. And so constitutional amendments are voted on by a majority of the House and the Senate. The governor has no role in it. And then it goes on to the ballot. We're working for the Equal Rights Amendment to be on the ballot for the 2026 election in November. so next year. And we would want to use that as a campaign to just have the biggest campaign that is vocal about love and support for trans people, as well as really also fighting against racism, misogyny, and discrimination against people with disabilities, and then as well as working for reproductive freedom. So it really is just like all of the issues that I think a lot of us care about, that we get to put those legal protections into the Constitution, and have a campaign that's based on love.
And how do folks so if they want to work on that right now before it's even on the ballot, is there ways that folks can support that?
Sure. Well, so for one, sign up to get Gender Justice's emails. We also have a lot of resources on our website, which includes resources on how to talk about trans inclusion in sports. We have resources on just know your rights as well. And then also we have ways to get involved in both the pushing for people to come out on the side of supporting J.C. Cooper and trans inclusion in sports. We have all those resources. And then we have ways to get involved in the Equal Rights Amendment work as well.
Perfect. I have more questions for you. Thankfully, we have one more break to get to, so we are going to fit in that break. Folks, please connect with our sponsors and advertisers that you hear in our at commercial breaks. They make conversations like the one that we're having right now possible. So connect with them, shop with them, do business with them, and tell them that you heard about them on The Gailey Show right here on AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Stay tuned. We're going to have more after this commercial break. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I am your host, John Parker. It is 9 minutes before the top of the hour. We are here talking with Gabby and Monica from Gender Justice about their trans equity trainings. Gabby, a lot of what I appreciated about the trains as I was looking through the materials is how conversation focused it is. And you were both mentioning that earlier. And Monica, you had brought up about how we were a few years ago dealing with a constitutional amendment that would have banned gay marriage. And one of the ways that we really sort of fought back against that within the community was having lots of deep conversations with folks across the state, which a lot of it was like phone banking and then, phones or conversations around the, dining room table. Gabby, can you talk about how these conversations tap into the shared values and principles that we have? That shared humanity that you're all sort of tapping into as you're doing these trainings to help us just sort of all coalesce into a community of justice-loving people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that people value individual freedom and self-determination. I think that people generally can agree that the body you're born with shouldn't determine who you're allowed to be in life, for example, and that who you are is something that is for you to discover, and that's a fundamental right. I don't know many people, if anyone, who think that identity is something that the government should decide for you. I think that people determine who they are, not the state, and that infringing on this really violates people's fundamental right to self-determination. And so that's one thing that feels really valuable to ground on in these conversations, is just the shared values of individual freedom and self-determination. And to that end, it's also important to remember that when talking about trans people, we're not talking about abstract concepts or ideology. We're talking about real people, and these people are our neighbors, our colleagues, our families, and people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. I mentioned earlier, I think, how trans people have always existed across cultures, history, and time, and I think at the end of the day that no person should have their humanity called into question, period. And regardless of differences in politics and things like that, I think that these are all things that really just kind of cut to just the heart of being a person. I think that people value empathy and understanding over cruelty and dehumanization, and really speaking to these values, I think, can produce really good conversations that guide people towards a better understanding of trans issues and being able to see trans people just as the people that they are.
What comes up for me as I hear you say that is, when I've had conversations like, well, how come queer people and trans people are everywhere all of a sudden? And I'm like, well, no, it's not all of a sudden. I think there is that desire for that empathy, which is why we're finally seeing that reflected in our art. We're seeing that reflected in films finally, and it's not to where we need it to be. Yes, I want to acknowledge that, but just finally see, representations of trans life in TV and film and books, positive depictions on the news, these things. I remember like when I was growing up, the only representation I saw were gay men dying of AIDS. That framed my entire way of understanding myself and what my life was going to be. So I think that it's having that empathy is where we finally see this art, and then finally able to mainstream and see the full collection of folks that actually do live in this country and are our neighbors and our colleagues and our friends and family members. I know that there's a lot of focus on the attacks coming in, and we mentioned the Equal Rights Amendment. I want to end on an upbeat note about the collection and as we're coming up on time here. Where do both of you see the fight going here? And it's more of in a positive sense of creating community and taking care of each other. And Monica, maybe we want to start with you.
Sure. I really do see that we just really need to continue to build the sheer number of people who are speaking out for trans justice, who are speaking out and talking about what's on their hearts, what they want, the values that they want to see depicted, not just at the Capitol, and in DC, but just in their communities. What I do already see is just a lot of people feeling like this is happening to them and they don't quite know what to do. And we really want to just encourage people to just start talking to people about how you support trans people. Start looking for ways to go to art shows that are by trans artists, to support music, you name it, whatever you like to do. Go support sports teams, sports, athletics, you name it, but just get out there with just as many ways as you can show that you support and love trans people. And you're really for a justice for everyone.
Absolutely. I don't want to come across as like Pollyanna in this, but like we're fighters and we're creatives and we are community builders. And so I want to affirm that in us. And Gabby, how about for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that despite everything going on right now, that trans people really have a thriving community, especially here in Minnesota and in the Twin Cities. And that's a really beautiful thing to see, I think, against, the backdrop of, just the things going on in the broader political climate. And I think it's, it's reassuring to me to see that and to see that resilience and to see trans people continuing to build community, to come together in spaces for art and spaces for joy and spaces to build political power. And it's also incredibly reassuring to see the hundreds of people, the thousands of people that are showing up in support for trans people and who see what's happening and are rejecting it outright and showing up to let trans people know that they aren't alone and that they're here to help fight as well. And I think, there's a lot of power ahead.
What a way to end it. Thank you both so much for being here today. Links to all of this in our show notes and on our website, am950radio.com. The Matt McNeil Show is coming up next. After that, stay tuned for Native Roots Radio. And until tomorrow at 2 p.m., keep it queer, America.